MS Now's Fallon Gallagher is outside the courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia. I also want to bring in MS Now senior investigative reporter Carol Leonnig and MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin. Fallon, you were inside, I understand. Explain what happened, but also just the mood inside that room.
Yeah, Chris, this was really interesting because former FBI Director James Comey made his first court appearance in the second criminal case against him brought by the President Trump's Department of Justice in this courthouse behind me. Now, coincidentally, this appearance was before the same magistrate judge who oversaw his first criminal matter. But the whole thing was really swift and procedural. It lasted about 7 minutes in total. His family was in the courtroom. You saw them walk in earlier. He was flanked by the same two lawyers who represented him in the first case. So in some regards, there was a little bit of deja vu inside. But on the other side of the courtroom was that prosecutor out of North Carolina who actually his name is on the indictment, this 2-count indictment. The whole thing was very quick, and I want to be really clear that this was not an arraignment, so he did not enter any sort of a plea. But the judge ran through the charge, understood what those charges meant, and that he had talked to his legal team about them. But again, he did not enter a plea. What I was hoping that we would learn today was some sort of an arraignment day, which, of course, will happen in North Carolina, the district where he's actually charged. He's not charged in the Eastern District of Virginia, but we have not gotten that date yet. That's still up in the air. What we did get a little bit, though, is a signal of where his legal team is leaning. His lawyer, Pat Fitzgerald, the same lawyer who represented him in the first criminal indictment, signaled that they plan to seek a motion to dismiss on the grounds of vindictive prosecution, which, of course, is something that they did in the first case, pointing to some of the inflammatory statements made by both the president and the DOJ. But again, the whole thing lasted only 7 minutes. It was very, very quick, and his family is already gone. Chris?
All right. Thank you so much for that. So, Lisa, as you know, the first indictment against Comey got thrown out because it was so weak. Is this one any stronger?
Well, let's start with why the first indictment got thrown out. It was weak, but it got thrown out on procedural grounds because the U.S. attorney at the time, Lindsay Halligan, was not lawfully appointed, and she was the only person to present to the grand jury. We never really got to the substance of the charges against Jim Comey. And one of his defenses, as Fallon had just mentioned, was selective and vindictive prosecution. To the extent that that was a strong motion before, and I and many other legal observers believe that it is doubly so now, because in the wake of the failure of that prosecution, now they have gone and prosecuted Jim Comey again. And you can expect to see his lawyer, Pat Fitzgerald, and Rebecca Donaleski, who also represents him, attached to that motion the same compendium of statements by President Trump. Before, it was a 60-page compendium of statements that President Trump had made against Jim Comey, indicating how much he wanted to go after him and hold him accountable. That is likely a longer list today than it was when Jim Comey was first prosecuted last fall, Chris.
Well, then there's also what they filed in this indictment, and it's been called a 3-page indictment. There really is only like one or two sentences that tell us anything about maybe what this case is. FBI Director Kash Patel, however, said that the investigation has not been simple, and I want to play what he said.
This has been a case that's been investigated over the past 9, 10, 11 months. These cases take time. Our investigators work methodically. They are career agents, career prosecutors who work these matters. They call the balls and strikes in the field as they see fit, pursuant to the facts of the case and the law.
I mean, could they potentially have been looking at all that time other than an Instagram post?
They could have been looking at transcripts or notes taken from their interview of Jim Comey. They could have been looking at other public statements that Jim Comey might have made that they believe are indicative of his intent. But in all likelihood, one of the things that they were also looking at is case law interpreting the statutes that they've charged him with. One of the statutes is 18 U.S.C. 871, which entails making threats against a president or a vice president. Historically, that has been interpreted to mean true threats that a reasonable person would interpret to be a serious threat against somebody's life or to cause them bodily injury. They understand that that is the standard because they have baked it into the indictment. If you read the indictment, they say that the seashell formation picture would be something that a reasonable person would interpret to be a threat. I don't know that they can meet that standard, but they understand that they have to meet it. And they most likely were spending some of those months trying to shore up their legal research to convince themselves that this was a threshold that they could meet. I'm not sure how they convinced themselves of that, but Chris, that may have been one of the things that they have been spending those intervening months doing.
So, Carol, Republican Congressman Mark Elford said he believed Comey's post should be taken very seriously. Here's that.
James Comey is a very intelligent man. I would assume he knows what the term 86 means. I was a waiter for some time. When you 86 an order, you kill the order. When you 86-45, that is tantamount to saying killing the President of the United States. He should have known that.
When you 86 an order, you get rid of the order, right? Correct. But you're not actually, I mean, you're not killing the food. I just want to be clear. When you
kill the order, it's the same principle.
Worth noting, former Congressman Matt Gaetz made an 86 post referring to fellow Republican lawmakers who were gone. The phrase has also been used in reference to President Biden. Are those people going to be prosecuted too, Carol?
No, there's no sign of any of that. I mean, yes, what I found striking about the press conference by the acting attorney general was he said, we're never going to tolerate threats against the president of the United States. But again, very similar threats against Joe Biden, including by a Trump influencer online that nobody is taking seriously or considering charging. And in this case, they've been allegedly investigating this since May of 2025, when the Secret Service were told to go and question former FBI Director Comey. And so for a year, they've been potentially working really hard on this case or potentially thinking it through. But usually charges of a threat against a president are brought rather quickly and swiftly after the intended threat. There are other people who've used 86 in all sorts of references, and I don't see any investigations of those. Another interesting thing is Attorney General Blanche said alongside his comment that they would never tolerate these kinds of threats, he mentioned that there had been one against a person online in Florida. But I noticed that the FBI director and the acting attorney general didn't hold a press conference to announce those charges.
And also, Carol, Todd Blanche declined to rule out a possible indictment against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer for displaying an 8645 sign. But if this is, as many people view it, part of Donald Trump's efforts to go against his political enemies, is it clear right now who else might be in the crosshairs?
Yeah, I want to be careful about what I say here, Chris. We are doing some active reporting now on basically who's teed up for potential charges in the near future. It just doesn't seem wise to report that here until we've met the standard for reporting it at MS Now. And trust me, stay tuned. We'll let you know. This is something we're actively looking at. I would also say that it's very clear Todd Blanche pushed this faster. And that is something we'll be reporting on in more detail. We've talked a little bit on air about Blanche's goal to take the acting out of his title and secure this job permanently. And he's taken several steps in the last several days. Really, in the last, I'd say, 72 hours, he's taken several steps to sort of show Trump that his priorities are Blanche's priorities, and that is going after the people Trump wants taken down and going and supporting the president in his legal or political arguments in court.